Well, it's a new year, and I think we're all glad to leave part of 2020 behind. And I want to take a look at what new beginnings might mean for us. But I want to start with something that happened to me just about a week ago. I was going to a local restaurant where you pick up your food to take out, and I know the people there. It's sort of a deli, and one of the women that is there, young woman in her 30s, I'd say, early 30s, was telling me a little bit about her life, and she had a beautiful accent, and I asked where it was from, and it's from Belgium, and she's from the French-speaking part of Belgium. I really didn't know anything about Belgium, to be honest, other than chocolate, but and so we talked a little about Belgium, and then the story came out that her grandparents had come through during World War II from Russia, so she's of Russian descent, and had actually been captured. I don't know all the details, but were in a German prisoner of war camp, escaped, somehow made their way to Belgium, and so now the whole family has been raised in Belgium, and then this young woman has emigrated to the United States, and I said, well, how long have you been here? And she told me, and then she mentioned that she had just gone through a divorce. It was a hard time in her life, and I said, oh, I'm so sorry, and she said, don't be. Actually, I'm happier than I've ever been. And as a pastor, I tend to think of divorce as, certainly what you don't want. But in this case, it sounds like it was a liberation from a difficult situation, the details of which I don't know. And then she said, my grandparents were married for 70 years. And she said it so incredulously. And she says, I just can't imagine staying with the same person for 70 years. And I said, well, I've been married to the same woman for 50 years. And she kind of looked at me a little shocked. And she said, oh, well, I get it. It's probably more about companionship than passion. And I thought, ouch. And I said, well, there's still quite a bit of passion left. And she laughed and she went, oh, isn't that sweet? So I thought, oh my, well, what is it about? And I started thinking about my marriage at 50 years, going on 51 now, and how Linda and I met when she was 17 and I would have been, I guess, about 18 or 19. And our dating life, it was 90% passion. At least I can only speak for me. And I remember driving down. We lived in Denver. I was at the University of Denver. She lived in Littleton, a suburb of Denver. And in those days, there was this road, US 85, Santa Fe. It was also called Santa Fe Boulevard. And it was kind of going through a seedy part of town, just some kind of dilapidated motels on their way out, and a lot of gas stations, as I remember. And it was a 2-lane. Now it's all beautiful, but in those days. And I remember driving my 1967 red Volkswagen with a canvas top. And I'd be driving. It'd take me about 25 minutes to get to her house. And the closer I got, I would literally start yipping and yelling like, I get to see her, I get to see her. And then we'd see each other, and I'd drive back, and I'd be singing and cheering. Now, I have to admit, I haven't driven toward home recently and been yipping and yelling. I'm very grateful to see Linda. I love being married to her, and I realize, it has shifted some. Still plenty of passion, but it's more about being together. And then I thought of the whole trajectory of the relationship, and 80% passion, 10% friendship. Then it becomes more like 60-40. And then there's a whole era, a long one, of raising 3 children when, frankly, we were partners. We were running a business called Raise 3 Children Business. And every day it was a negotiation. What are we going to do with this one? And that one's, I think, going a little this way. And how do we help this one? And how do we pay for those lessons? And it was a partnership. And then it changed after they got out of the nest to back to more friendship and negotiating it. And all the way along, my relationship with Linda was not a transaction. Although it began with a transaction, it began with me saying, will you marry me? And then walking down the aisle in our little Presbyterian church in Littleton, Colorado, and saying, I'm committing my life to you for life, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, until only death will separate us. That was a major transaction, but then it began a journey. So the spiritual life is very much like that. It may start with a transaction where you say, I want to surrender my heart to God, to Jesus, to the Holy Spirit. I want to invite Jesus into my life. Whatever terms you want to put on it, there are moments in time in the spiritual journey when there are transactions. But the spiritual journey is not a transaction. It's a journey with many transactions. You know, the Scriptures have this interesting dichotomy. In Revelation 21, the very last book of the New Testament, we hear this. God is talking about what God is doing in the world. And he says this. He's speaking from the throne, it says. And it says this, he who was seated on the throne, John is having this vision of heaven. He sees God seated on the throne, or Jesus seated on the throne. And the voice says, the one on the throne said, I am making all things new. So there's God talking about the journey, that even God's process of making things new is verbs are important sometimes in the scripture. Making all things new. It's a process. But then you hear the Apostle Paul say this about our life in our spiritually awakened life. He says this in 2 Corinthians chapter 5. Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, he or she is a new creation. The old is gone and the new is here. The old is gone and the new is here. That's a transaction. That's a point in time. The old's gone now, and the new's arrived. Well, what happened to this making all things new? Now we seem to be saying it's already new. Well, it's both. The spiritual life, like my relationship with my dear wife, is a process with many transactions along the way, many adaptations, because we become different people as we move along. I've often said, you know, I've been married to 5 different women. They all happen to be the same person. My wife, Linda, you know, she's changed, and so have I. And so we've renegotiated. That's the way the spiritual life is supposed to be as well. It's a journey, not a transaction. And since it's a journey, it's complete with all the things that happen on journeys. Think about your vacations. Think about those epic movies, Vacation, and all the crazy things that happen. A journey is complete with setbacks. It's struggles, pain, but breakthroughs, wonderful breakthroughs, insights, deliverances, when you've been delivered from some nagging addiction or temptation or struggle that you have. Journeys are complete with progress. You move from one place to another. But sometimes they also have regress. You went the wrong way, you took the wrong turn, and you've gone 20 miles out of your way, and the only way back is you have to turn around and go that way. They're full of journeys, are full of recoveries from various issues and things and struggles, and they're also full of relapses. You know, my friends in AA say that relapse is part of recovery. That's true in the spiritual journey. It's like that. It's like hiking. You've heard me talk so much about the Camino, which I had the privilege of hiking in 2015, I guess it was. And we hiked these 500 miles over 37 days. And There were many transactions along the way. Which route are we going to take today? My hiking buddy and I would look at the map and we'd say, well, if we go this route, it's a lot higher and steeper, but it's also shorter. If we go this route, it's a lot longer, but not as hard. Okay, let's make a decision. One day we made a decision to take this harder route because we heard it was really beautiful. And as we got to the beginning of the route, spray painted on the wall in Spanish, it said, "Locos, you crazy people, don't take this route. Peligro, it's really dangerous." And I translated it for my friend Art, and we kind of looked at each other and went, well, we got to make a decision. Do you think we can do it? We've been hiking for 3 weeks. We're pretty strong. Well, let's take it. We made a transactional decision, and it was a very difficult day. It was just a long, long day and a beautiful, beautiful day. So we had a transaction, and then the journey followed on with its ups and downs. We ran out of water that day, the only time we ever did. You know, on these journeys, we make these decisions. So my question to you is, going into this new year, what are the transactions you need to make with God to deepen your spiritual journey? You know, I read a book just recently about the pioneers who moved from the East Coast. This is back in the the late 1600s, early 1700s, moved into Ohio, which was a complete wilderness. It was covered with trees. They called all of the Midwestern states the dark states because they weren't farmland. They were thick, deciduous forests. And it talked about the pioneers coming down the river there and setting up and having to clear these huge trees out just to build a cabin, and how some people settled and some people went a little further down the river. And then they got down a little further down the river, and then a little further down the river, each one taking them further west. And there was this interesting dichotomy between people who decided to settle and people who decided to keep going on. And your spiritual life is like that. You hit certain plateaus where you go, wow, we just came around the bend of the river, and this looks like a great place to stay. You know, I've studied the Bible quite a bit, and I go to church, you know, fairly often, and once in a while I go to a spiritual retreat. This is kind of a nice place to, let's just settle here. This is spiritually deep enough for me. Well, there's a lot more down the river. It might be all right to settle for a while to build some roots, but in the spiritual life, we're actually meant to keep moving down the river and keep moving toward the deeper places in our own lives and toward the deeper places in God. There's a great verse that just simply says, in the Old Testament, it says, deep calls unto deep. The deep in God calls the deep in you. And you sense that at certain times. Maybe you've set up camp on the river and you begin to feel deep calling unto deep. Will you respond, or will you stay with the security? Because it's less secure when you get back on the river. You don't know what's around the next bend. You don't know if you're taking the loco route where you run out of water. But you miss all the beautiful views. You miss the growth. You miss the deepening of your spirit. This is one of the problems in Christianity, in my opinion, is that people have settled. Literally, they've settled, stopped and set up a settlement. Or in the other sense of the word, they've settled. Like, it's not quite what we thought, but we'll settle for it. And I think we've settled when deep is calling unto deep. And we're meant to learn to journey further. Now, here's the problem. Along the journey, as I mentioned, there are all these difficulties and struggles, failures and successes. And my wife was saying to me the other day, just a wonderful phrase I've heard her use before, but it kind of hit me at a deeper level. She said, we're all just making our way. You know, that is the spiritual life. It's not, oh, hey, I found my way, and now everything is smooth sailing. We're all just making our way through with our recoveries and relapses, our deliverances and our struggles. We're just making our way through. And when I was hiking on the Camino, I remember this one day a woman we were hiking with had terrible blisters on her feet, and we all had to kind of stop and help her with that. And I finally had to call, because I spoke Spanish, and call a cab literally to take her to the next town because she just couldn't walk. It was a setback for her, but it affected the team, so to speak. It affected the community, and we had to slow down to help her get along in another way. That's part of the journey, being in it together, helping one another through these times when it gets a little bit more difficult. So do we want to be a settler, or do we want to be a pioneer? Do we want to move on in the spiritual life or stay? Do we give in to the fact that when we have a setback, we get down on ourselves? Why did I do that again? Why didn't I do that? I was supposed to do that and didn't. Or I shouldn't have done that and I did. Oh, what is wrong with me? A setback. What do we do with those? Well, if we have the idea that we're supposed to have it all together at this moment in our life, we've settled, we've got a nice little settlement, we've got a nice ordered spiritual life, then that's not going to work. But if we think of it as a journey that we're all just making our way, we're making our way around the next bend. If we see it as the spiritual life as not a transaction, but a journey with a lot of transactions, then you can ask yourself at this moment, what is the transaction you need to make? Is there one? Maybe there isn't one. I made a decision just this morning, actually, about some things I want to do in my own spiritual life differently in terms of my own quiet interior meditations. It's a transaction I conducted with God or transacted with God this morning. We'll see how well I do with it, but it's a decision I've made to grow more in this new year, responding to deep, calling unto deep. What is God asking of you? I guarantee you God is asking you to move further down the river. And if you're settling, then he's going to be asking you to use what you're learning in the settlement to, when the time is right, move on down the river. You know, I'll close with this. A speaker I really like, Dr. Jim Finley, uses this phrase about the spiritual life, and this may be a suggestion you should consider for this year. He said, you know, when you see these great Olympic divers, and they're in the Olympics, and they go out to the edge of the diving board, and the board's kind of going like this, and they turn around, and they stand there so beautifully like this backwards on the board, and the board's still kind of doing this. And just before they initiate their dive, they pause. They just pause there. And then they initiate their dive, and it's a beautiful dive, graceful. But without the pause, it wouldn't be so lovely. They dive out of the pause. That might mean for us in the spiritual life that right now is a time to pause, not to jump into action, not to jump onto the riverboat and go right now down the river like I've been suggesting, but maybe take the month of January and pause and ask. The scripture says, be still and know that I am God. Stillness is a major discipline in the spiritual life. And it's one that, at least those of us in North America, we are trained to be very busy, very agitated, running from here to there. Stillness, pausing, is not a part of what our culture teaches us, but it is what Jesus teaches. It is what the Spirit teaches many times, to pause in order to dive, and to dive with grace. You don't just pause and stay. You know, can you imagine that diver just pausing up there, then turning around and walking back? I mean, it wouldn't go over real well. You pause in order to deepen and live your life with grace. So in these next few weeks, I'm going to be talking about this journey and some tools for the journey and some skills for the journey. But my hope is that you will make your spiritual life not just a transaction, but a journey with many transactions, you responding to the deep in God, calling forth the deep in you.
down to the sea. It's flowing like thunder and calling to me, where mercy is growing, where justice is found, and the water is roaring in a glorious sound, wider than sorrow and deeper than fear. Mercy is flowing and justice is here. The river is filled with the strength of his love. Traveler, drink, your thirst is enough. Oh, keep to the river, oh, walk by the shore, and go where it takes you, worry no more. For there's peace in the thunder and power in the flood. Let them both overtake you, that's the reason you come. Wider than sorrow and deeper than fear. Mercy is flowing and justice is here. Yeah, the river is filled with the strength of his love. Traveler, drink, your thirst is enough. Oh, traveler, rest, yes, it's you that's been changed from your past inhibitions, from the plans that you made, and the truth in your journey, you were never alone. For the river is wide and will carry you home, wider than sorrow and deeper than fear. Mercy is flowing and justice is here. Yeah, the river is filled with the strength of his love. Traveler, rest, your thirst is enough. Traveler, drink, your thirst is enough. Traveler, drink, your thirst is enough.
Well, thanks, Kathleen, for that music. As always, we just love your voice. It's such a beautiful part of our congregation and our gathering. I wanted to give you kind of a final update on our finances for the year. I'm recording this on the 31st of December, so it might be a little bit different. But you'll remember that we had a $30,000 matching gift that we felt if we could match it would bring us to the end of the year in the black. So if we could raise the $30,000, it would be matched, making $60,000. Well, as of today, we raised a little over $41,000 to match the $30,000. So it's just so tremendous, the generosity that you have all shown during this difficult year. It tells me that our community has stayed knit together tightly, even though we've had to go to this sort of online presence primarily. And it tells me that when we say the church is not the building, it's the people, it's very clearly true. And your generosity of spirit has gotten us through this year, and I know it'll get us through in the year ahead as well, in hopefully some really beautiful ways. Thanks so much.